So, welcome to the first ever episode of the ProPeace Report. My name is Kobe, and I'm going to be the host of the show. So, first, just a little background about me. I'm an independent journalist. My bachelor's degree was in journalism and political science with a minor in environmental studies. I'm currently pursuing my master's degree in human rights studies at Lund University in Sweden. And I'm also an activist. I've been protesting since 2016, been involved in political activism a little bit since 2015, but I've been following politics since middle school, high school. And so the big point of the show, just a little brief little overview before I get started. Um, the whole point of the show for me is kind of just covering news, interviewing people, whether it be experts in a certain field, whether it be organizers, or whether it just be average people in general. Um, I consider myself an anarcho-communist. So basically, I believe in a stateless, classless society. That's the end goal. Not going to talk about that a lot today. We'll talk about it in another episode. But a big highlight of today's show, and basically every show that I'm going to have, is anti-imperialism. And so I think in the US, being the global hegemon, the empire of the world, I think we have a unique responsibility to confront US imperialism head on, you know, because we are basically oppressing the world. And today's episode will almost entirely cover that topic. I hope at the end of the episode today, you'll be able to see what I mean by us oppressing the world. But so let's dive in now first. So the topics today that we're going to be discussing: US sanctions, the hypocrisy of US sanctions and how they actually harm people instead of helping people. So before we say that, the whole point of US sanctions, the stated goals of US sanctions are to basically hold other countries accountable for their human rights abuses. And so the whole idea is supposed to be that, oh, this country is attacking the free press, or this country is having a brutal police crackdown on people. And so the US government and, the UN governments around the world, Western governments typically, they implement these sanctions on countries because in their eyes, if we can hurt them economically, it's not military intervention. We're not going to war with them. So it must be better, right? As we're going to see today, that is not the case at all. And so now I'm going to share my screen with you all, and we'll kind of dive into that topic. So this is the US Department of Treasury, sanctions programs and country information. So these are all the places that the US has sanctions now. And last I've heard, it's about 39 different countries that are impacted by US sanctions. This list here, I think, has about 37 when I counted. Let's look at a few of them. We've got Belarus sanctions. We've got Burma-related sanctions. We've got Cuba sanctions, counterterrorism sanctions, Ethiopia-related sanctions, Hong Kong, Iran, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon, North Korea, Nicaragua, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Venezuela. And so you can see we sanction a lot of countries, and both parties participate in this, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But so I wanted to kind of highlight a few of these sanctions that we are engaged in. And so let's start here with humanitarian impact of sanctions on Venezuela. So I'll read a little bit. On 12th of February 2021, Elena Duhan, the UN Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures in Human Rights, released a preliminary report condemning international sanctions against Venezuela. So that's the UN condemning unilateral sanctions against Venezuela. Over 5 years since these sanctions were first introduced, the country faces a desperate humanitarian crisis, whilst the Maduro regime remains in place, calling into question the morality and efficacy of such measures. And it'll explain just how bad US sanctions on Venezuela have been for the people of Venezuela. Many major world powers have implemented coercive measures against Venezuela in response to public corruption, human rights abuses, and anti-democratic actions taken by the Maduro government. The US has led the most severe sanctions, which began when President Obama, so this is kind of highlighting a little bit how these are bipartisan, both Democrats and Republicans, declared a national emergency and implemented targeted sanctions in 2015. Not so targeted, as we'll see. The 2018 Venezuelan presidential election was shrouded in controversy and placed the country in political turmoil amid a battle for presidency between incumbent Nicolas Maduro and the leader of the National Assembly, Juan Guaido. The Trump administration was one of the first to officially recognize Guaido as interim president in January 2019 and proceeded to embark on a campaign of maximum pressure designed to loosen Maduro's illegitimate grip on power. Now, Maduro did win elections. It's disputed whether those elections were free and fair or not, but he did win the elections. Basically, the whole argument being put out by the US and the West in general is that because they cracked down on opposition leading up to the election was entirely illegitimate. And in the Venezuelan constitution, it says that if, there's something, basically says that if elections are not fair or if no leader is decided or whatever, that the Speaker of the House becomes, or their equivalent of the Speaker of the House becomes the president, which would have been Juan Guaido, who didn't stand in these elections, didn't win any votes, is not broadly popular. That's why it's been so controversial. Maduro does have popularity in the country, regardless of, whether we think the election was fully fair or not. So in August 2019, Trump scaled up sanctions and authorized a full economic embargo against Venezuela. Sanctions introduced by the EU in 2017 and upheld by the UK post-Brexit have prohibited the admission of listed individuals in member countries, banned the export of certain goods such as arms and telecommunications equipment, and frozen Venezuelan assets in the territory of the EU and the UK. That's been billions, hundreds of billions of dollars frozen. And so here we get to more of the specifics. Venezuela was once the largest economic power in Latin America, but now finds itself in a dire situation amid consistent economic decline since 2014, around the time of these sanctions. This has been exacerbated by sanctions on core industries of oil, gold, and manufacturing, and the freezing of central bank assets. Dohan reports a 99% decline in government revenue compared to pre-sanction levels, which has led to a near collapse or a near complete breakdown of public services due to insufficient funding. In an interview with the Gray Zone, Dohan states, before the blockade, Venezuela was spending 76% of its oil revenues on social programs. Now it can't even invest 1% of that. Dohan argues that sanctions on the economic activity directly impede the government's ability to guarantee the human rights of its population, which has had a devastating effect on the whole population of Venezuela. And so one of the big reasons why this is so important, the 76% of oil revenues and social programs, that was very controversial for US politicians. They did not like the fact that Venezuela nationalized their oil and kept the profits for their own selves, for their social programs. John Bolton himself, who was in the Trump administration, John Bolton had said that they wanted US oil companies to be allowed in. Juan Guaido, person they wanted in power, had said he was going to let them come in. And so this just shows it's from 76% on social programs to less than 1%. And so you hear a lot about starvation in Venezuela, you hear a lot about medical shortages, and that's why a lot of people flee Venezuela. But they often blame the Maduro regime without mentioning how US sanctions have significantly contributed to the problem. Let's move on to another example, Iran. So here is from Human Rights Watch. Iran, sanctions threatening health. US should ensure effective humanitarian exemptions. It's very hard to get those exemptions. Usually sanctions in general just hurt the populations. The Trump administration's broad sanctions on Iran have drastically constrained the ability of the country to finance humanitarian imports, including medicines, causing serious hardships for ordinary Iranians and threatening their right to health. Human Rights Watch said in a report released today, The administration in Washington should take immediate steps to ensure a viable channel exists for the trade of humanitarian goods with Iran. The 47-page report, Maximum Pressure, which we've said before, that's kind of the US's angle with sanctions. U.S. economic sanctions harm Iranians' right to health, documents how broad restrictions on financial transactions, coupled with aggressive rhetoric from U.S. officials, have drastically constrained the ability of Iranian entities to finance humanitarian imports, including vital medicines and medical equipment. So that's another example of U.S. sanctions aimed for human rights purposes having human rights consequences. It's just showing us that sanctions are not peaceful. Sanctions are violent for the people that we impose them on. Here we go for another example. Cuba. Harm and inefficacy. The U.S. sanctions on Cuba. Over a span of 43 years and across 8 American presidencies, the CIA came up with or executed plans to assassinate former Cuban leader Fidel Castro about 638 times. So in the example of Cuba, sanctions have not been just the only tool we've attempted to use. There have been explicit regime change attempts for decades. These plans ranged from spiking Castro's cigars with a botulinum toxin, I can say it, that would explode when used, to contaminating Castro's diving suits with deadly fungi, to character assassination attempts that involved spraying his broadcasting studio with LSD-like drugs. Although these plans failed one after the other, the US government remained undeterred and would continue assassination attempts until the end of the Clinton administration. So again, bipartisan, both parties, Democrats and Republicans. Ever since the founding of Cuba and their almost immediate alignment with the Eastern Bloc and against American imperialism, our main topic of the day, the US has taken an aggressively hostile approach toward the nation, trying to stage a coup through the Bay of Pigs invasion, sending spies to infiltrate the Cuban government, and hatching schemes to assassinate Castro. Though all of these plots have either completely failed or seen very limited success, the US has, in fact, implemented one thing that saw tremendous success, not in terms of its purported aims, but rather in hurting the Cuban people. Sanctions. US sanctions against Cuba not only hurt both Cuban and American citizens, but also serve none of their intended political ends for the United States. Although they are aimed at pressuring Cuba to liberalize and democratize, such results have failed to materialize. Instead, sanctions have become a source of both economic and humanitarian damages for both Cubans and Americans. The sanctions were first implemented in October of 1960 and banned the trade of all goods except food and humanitarian supplies. After overthrowing the previously US-backed Batista dictatorship, Castro sought to establish friendly relations between Cuba and the US and made overtures to the neighboring nation, all of which were rebuffed by a distrustful Eisenhower administration. Well, that's because Castro overthrew their dictatorship, huh? In the following months, the US government viewed Cuba with increasing suspicion and hostility as Cuba established growing ties with the Soviet Union, communists. This tension culminated in Eisenhower's decision to ban all US oil exports to Cuba. Cuba had no choice but to turn to the Soviet Union for oil, but when oil arrived in Cuba, Eisenhower forbade the US-owned companies in Cuba from refining it. Castro was essentially forced to nationalize the US oil firms. And it is this action that directly prompted the embargo against Cuba. Similar to Venezuela, American capitalists do not like when socialist countries, communist countries, when they attempt to nationalize the oil. Because when you nationalize the oil, it's no longer in the hands of private industry. Now it's owned by the state and used for social welfare for that state. They do good things with that money, but the US wants that money. The embargo has not been lifted since. Barack Obama, to his credit, tried to lift it, but was blocked by Congress. In a bipartisan fashion, I'll add. The economic cost of these sanctions is steep, and this is where we get into the important part. According to the United Nations, the embargo has cost Cuba roughly $130 billion in economic value over 6 decades. Although this number may seem negligible, It is in fact about 1.5 times Cuba's annual GDP of $87 billion. So we're depriving the Cubans of hundreds of billions of dollars. At the same time, the U.S. International Trade Commission estimates that if the U.S. lifts the embargo, the U.S. export of select agricultural sectors and all manufactured products to Cuba would increase by about $1.8 billion annually. It's a lot of money that the Cuban government would be getting if we weren't sanctioning them. During Cuba's economic crisis last year, Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel blamed Trump's tightening sanctions, which he claimed severely limited their economic growth. I mean, we got evidence of that right there. More importantly, the embargo has a sizable human toll. Studies have shown that the embargo contributes to, or quote, contributes to increasing health threats and the decline of some health indicators, unquote, along with making the, quote, supply of essential goods more costly, more difficult, and more time-consuming to procure and maintain. Additionally, medical restrictions as a result of the embargo have been linked with historic increases in tuberculosis deaths, diarrheal cases, and contaminated water. A nationwide pandemic of optic and peripheral neuropathy was linked with food shortages caused by the embargo, and more recently, the Cuban government has argued that the embargo is a massive obstacle in receiving coronavirus-related supplies. And again, all of this just shows we haven't overthrown the government of Cuba. We haven't changed the government of Cuba. They are trying to be socialist. They are trying to use their money for their own people, for their own good, and the U.S. doesn't like it. So another big example, North Korea, the humanitarian impact of sanctions on North Korea. Since North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006, something they do to prevent, that's my own aside, that's something they do to protect themselves from the U.S. During the Korean War, the U.S. killed 1/4 of the population of North Korea. In order to defend their goal of a socialist government, North Korea feels that nuclear weapons are necessary as a deterrent, because if they have nuclear weapons, the U.S. can't invade them again. And we're still threatening that in South Korea. We're still constantly threatening that on North Korea. The UN Security Council has imposed nearly a dozen sanctions against the country, adding to unilateral US sanctions. While advocates of sanctions may regard them as a peaceful alternative to military action, as I've stated before, there is evidence that sanctions take a significant humanitarian toll on the North Korean people, restricting the work of NGOs, humanitarian agencies, and aid groups that provide a lifeline for some 13 million vulnerable North Koreans. In direct contravention of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, sanctions punish North Korean civilians for the actions of their government. Here's how sanctions harm ordinary North Koreans. Sanctions hinder urgently needed humanitarian aid and could result in devastating long-term effects. Are we sensing a pattern here yet? That US sanctions, global sanctions against countries we consider authoritarian, hurt their people? According to a 2018 UNICEF report, 200,000 North Korean children already suffer from acute malnutrition, and sanctions put 60,000 of these vulnerable children at risk of starvation due to the disruption in the availability of humanitarian supplies caused by tightening sanctions. Unilateral US sanctions delay or outright block vital humanitarian shipments to the North Korean people. One NGO recently reported that it took them over 1.5 years to ship 16 boxes of beans to the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Sanctions passed in 2017 prohibit the transport of any metal goods, significantly hampering the shipment of basic medical supplies. A shipment of reproductive health kits was subjected to significant delay because it contained aluminum steam sterilizers, the most important part of the kit. Sanctions target North Korea's civilian economy and harm the most vulnerable members of its population. More examples. Current sanctions have the greatest impact not on the power elites, who are the intended targets, but on the most vulnerable North Koreans, working class families, particularly children, and seniors living in remote areas with restricted access to medical supplies, food, and fuel for cooking and heating. Additionally, bans on exports and the dispatch of workers abroad impact the ability of ordinary citizens to support their livelihood. The ban on textile exports, in particular, is exerting a disproportionate effect on female employment, which represents the majority of the labor force in that sector. I mean, it's just crazy how we do these things because we claim we want to protect the people of these countries. We want to save them from a dictatorial government. And what ends up happening? We just kill people. We deprive them of food. We deprive them of medicines. We deprive them of the right to choose their own destiny. We're forcing our will on them. It's not what their people are asking for. And so there is a bill, here, let me talk about it here, the Renacer Act, and it's basically more sanctions, but this time on the country of Nicaragua. And so I'm going to play a video from Barbara Larcom, coordinator of CASA Baltimore LeMay. Just for a little context on that, they're a friendship city project connecting the people of San Juan de LeMay, Nicaragua, and the Baltimore, Maryland region. I'm near there, about 30 minutes away where I grew up. And so I'm going to play this video from Barbara, and we're going to hear just how pervasive these sanctions are.
The Renacer Act, which already passed the U.S. Senate, and it passed one committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, but it has not passed the second committee, and so we still have a chance to beat this thing, okay? And that's what we're trying to do here. H.R. 2946 is an act or a bill which supposedly is promoting democracy in Nicaragua. That is a total lie. I call BS on that one. So what the Renacer Act is really doing is, if it passes, it will impose even more restrictions on any international aid from any international financial institution on the country. And the MiCA Act already did great damage. And second, it is targeting sanctions. In other words, it at least allows the president to put sanctions on any individuals in the country who are, and I'm going to read some of these, if they work for the government, if they are a member of the FSLN. Now, there are 2 million or more registered members of the FSLN in a country of 6.3 million people, and that includes the kids, okay? They could also target the families of any party members, regardless of whether they're in the FSLN or not. It also applies to anybody who's in the National Police, the Armed Forces, or the Supreme Electoral Council. So in other words, over half the country could be liable for these sanctions. And so what that does is it is targeting only one side of the political spectrum in Nicaragua, and it happens to be the side that is the most popular in the country, because the FSLN is broadly supported because of the good that they have been doing since 2007 when they came back into power.
I mean, this is what we talk about when you hear the word targeted sanctions, because, you know, we have military action, right? And that's portrayed as the worst thing possible. Then we have sanctions, which are portrayed as a more peaceful option. And then they have that weasel word of targeted sanctions. We're not sanctioning the people of that country. We're targeting them so that it only impacts the bad guys. So it only impacts the people that we want to take out of power because they're hurting people. As demonstrated right here, that's more than half of the country of Nicaragua that could be impacted by these sanctions. And she says a little bit more.
Basically then, the United States, or at least this proposed bill, is claiming to promote democracy in the country, but instead what they're really doing is they're doing the exact opposite. They're preventing people, or they're trying to prevent people from voting their will for who they want as a leader in the country. So we're asking, this is very important, I think, that we need to stop, we need to ask the U.S. to stop interfering in all these different countries, Nicaragua being one, but there are others, as Jill was talking about the sanctions, we've got, 39 countries that are sanctioned right now. We don't want this to pass in Nicaragua. The capitalist system that we're operating under, that is really what's behind this, because that system wants to be able to come in, open up the markets in Nicaragua, and plunder the country, to use people, pay them low wages and plunder all of their resources, as they have done in so many other places around the world. Please call and ask Congress to oppose the Renacer Act. Thank you.
And that's exactly what U.S. sanctions are intended for, as I demonstrated with the Venezuela example. They put sanctions on a country that is socialist, like Venezuela, like the DPRK, like Nicaragua, because they don't want socialism. The capitalists want to be able to exploit the labor of workers to enrich themselves. They don't want that money going to the social services of that country. We see it in the US with how they always pay us poverty level wages, deprive us of healthcare, deprive us of education. And the US not only does that on their own people, US capitalists attempt to do it on people around the world. And so now I'm going to show you the Renacer Act itself. So who are the main co-sponsors of this act? So I said there is a bill in the US Senate that seeks to sanction nearly half of the population of Nicaragua for democracy. Sanctions threaten lives. Most co-sponsors are Democrats. We have Senator Menendez of New Jersey, Marco Rubio in Florida. He's the only Republican on this co-sponsor list. Senator Durbin in Illinois. Senator Ben Cardin, my senator in Maryland. And Senator Murphy in Connecticut, which, if you'll remember, I don't have the tweet here on demand, but Senator Murphy admit that they were trying to do a regime change operation in Venezuela. And so back to that other thread, this one activist here, Netfa Freeman, he's a Pan-Africanist. He had a really, really, really good explanation of the hypocrisy of U.S. sanctions.
We just heard about the Renacer Act. We heard about the NICA Act. We also know about the terrorism that they orchestrate in the country, particularly in 2018. We know about the Contra War, the war that they put together, assembled mercenaries to try to fight the Sandinista government. Basically, these are just acts of terrorism. And the United States has the nerve to have a list of state sponsors of terror. If we look at the Renacer Act and NICA Act, when we think about it, and it's not just Nicaragua, it's all of these countries, that the United States has the audacity to actually codify into law their regime change projects while they talk about other countries influencing their elections and whatnot through, Facebook ads or something else like that. And so we know this pure hypocrisy. It treats indigenous people and formerly enslaved Africans here with the most brutal repression, economic marginalization, and degradation. And so it cannot talk about human rights or democracy in other countries. It's devoid of human rights and democracy. And it's insulting to us for them to claim that they're trying to support human rights and democracy in some other country.
I mean, he's exactly right. I already demonstrated on like 5 different countries how U.S. sanctions hurt human rights. They don't help them. And often they contradict with democracy of those countries. These sanctions here in Nicaragua are going to impact like half the population because that's the popular party in that country. The Sandinistas are popular. People like socialism in those countries. And we're going to show you more later in this video. We're about to finish the sanctions topic. But once we move on to Julian Assange and Daniel Hale and the hypocrisy of U.S. imperialism when it comes to drone warfare, when it comes to attacking the free press, it should be abundantly clear that this is not about human rights and democracy. This is about capitalism versus socialism. And so now that's the perfect segue into the big story that broke yesterday that's actually been out for quite some time now. But we'll talk about that. So let me stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to switch it to a new screen because we are going to talk about Julian Assange. Hang on a sec. There we go. So this was the big news story that broke yesterday that everybody was talking about. It's from Yahoo News. The headline, Kidnapping, Assassination, and a London Shootout Inside the CIA's Secret War Plans Against WikiLeaks. Now, there's a little background about myself. In 2016, I was really big on covering the WikiLeaks emails on Twitter. Every morning, I would wake up, read a new batch of those emails, and just highlight the most important ones and share them. They would go viral. I was kind of surprised. That was like my first foray into independent journalism. And now we're going to see just how deep the CIA plot and the US government's plot against Julian Assange has been. I've been protesting since April of this year in DC. I spoke at an event in front of the DOJ. I've been trying really, really, really hard to get leftists to understand that the case of Julian Assange is monumentally important to anti-imperialism. It is like a central problem today that the world is still grappling with. So let's start reading this article a little bit. In 2017, as Julian Assange began his 5th year holed up in Ecuador's embassy in London, the CIA plotted to kidnap the WikiLeaks founder, spurring heated debate among Trump administration officials over the legality and practicality of such operation. Some senior officials inside the CIA and the Trump administration even discussed killing Assange, going so far as to request sketches or options for how to assassinate him. Discussions over kidnapping or killing Assange occurred, quote, at the highest levels of the Trump administration, said a senior counterintelligence official. There seemed to be no boundaries. And so I'm going to explain a little here. There was one incident that actually happened, which very well could be connected to this event. This was in 2018 that this news story broke. As we saw here, they were discussing these things in 2017, the assassination or kidnapping attempts. So they very well might have tried it. So this story here, intruder tried to break into Ecuador embassy to kidnap Julian Assange, claim his legal team. You can see why they feared that was the case. WikiLeaks founder was woken up in the middle of the night by alleged intruder. He foiled the attempted break-in after setting up a booby trap near the window. Julian Assange knew what they were trying to do to him. He was very well aware of the attempts on his life that would have happened. And so, wow, he thought ahead and actually foiled one such possible attempt. Scaffolding was later erected against embassy in Knightsbridge, West London. Supporters of Mr. Assange claim he has been put at risk of abduction by Ecuador. We'll get into that too, the whole spying situation that happened with the security team there. And so that's not even really the most important topic. I just wanted to highlight that a little bit so that you could see somebody did try to break into the Ecuador embassy a year after Trump administration officials were discussing kidnapping or assassinating him. So they very well might have tried it. While Assange has been on the radar of US intelligence agencies for years, these plans for an all-out war against him were sparked by WikiLeaks' ongoing publication of extraordinarily sensitive CIA hacking tools known collectively as Vault 7. Which the agency ultimately concluded represented the largest data loss in CIA history. CIA's got a lot of secrecy. I mean, we could do entire videos about their spy operations they've had. President Trump's newly installed CIA director, Mike Pompeo, we're going to watch some videos from that guy, was seeking revenge on WikiLeaks and Assange, who had sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy since 2012 to avoid extradition to Sweden on rape allegations he denied. There's a lot of evidence that those allegations were drawn out. He was willing to answer all of the questions to that. I'll have to do a video someday so you can actually see how the Swedish government was basically meddling because they wanted to extradite him to the United States. He was willing to answer all the questions. The women weren't even accusing him of rape. They were accusing him of other things that were much lesser than that. They didn't want these charges to be like that, but that's an aside. Who had sought refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy, Pompeo and other top agency leaders were completely detached from reality because they were so embarrassed about Vault 7, said a former Trump national security official. They were seeing blood. The CIA's fury at WikiLeaks led Pompeo to publicly describe the group in 2017 as a, quote, non-state hostile intelligence service. And here, let's watch that video real quick.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service. It has encouraged its followers to find jobs at the CIA in order to obtain intelligence. It directed Chelsea Manning in her theft of specific secret information. It overwhelmingly focuses on the United States while seeking support from anti-democratic countries and organizations. It's time to call out WikiLeaks for what it really is: a non-state hostile intelligence service often abetted by state actors like Russia.
They're yet to find a shred of evidence that Russia was involved with WikiLeaks. The Mueller investigation couldn't find evidence of Russia helping WikiLeaks. I mean, there was an article I read, I don't know if I have it in the list here. They were so adamant about trying to connect him to Russia, and they couldn't find it, that they ended up calling him this non-state hostile intelligence service, because that was like the only way that they could sign off on some of these counter intelligence operations they tried against him. So let's go on. More than just a provocative talking point, the designation opened the door for agency operatives to take far more aggressive actions, treating the organization as it does adversary spy services, former intelligence officials told Yahoo News. Like I was saying, they couldn't connect him to a government itself, and so they gave him this new classification just so they could do these counter spy operations on him. Within months, US spies were monitoring the communications and movements of numerous WikiLeaks personnel, including audio and visual surveillance of Assange himself, according to former officials. Now, I thought this was very interesting that I have a video here. It's from WikiLeaks Twitter page in 2018, again, around the same time period. Release. Infrared footage of covert Julian Assange grab team stakeout operation reading mission briefing notes. Let's just watch this really quickly. There's no audio or anything, so we'll just watch it in here. So you see these guys are sitting in the car outside of the Ecuadorian embassy. This one in the back right over here, you'll see, yep, there he is reading the pages. Later in the video, you see this guy's looking over here and he hides his head. So it's very, very, very likely that this was the CIA or paid CIA spies spying on Assange right there. As we demonstrate here, it's evidence. We know for a fact they were doing this. This Yahoo News investigation, based on conversations with more than 30 former US officials, 8 of whom described details of the CIA's proposal to abduct Assange, so we've already showed the attempt on it, reveals for the first time one of the most contentious intelligence debates of the Trump presidency and exposes new details about the US government's war on WikiLeaks. It was a campaign spearheaded by Pompeo that bent important legal structures, potentially jeopardized the Justice Department's work toward prosecuting Assange, and risked a damaging episode in the United Kingdom, the US's closest ally. Now is where the story starts to get really crazy. It's like a spy movie almost. The CIA declined to comment. Pompeo did not respond to requests for comment. Quote, as an American citizen, I find it absolutely outrageous that our government would be contemplating kidnapping or assassinating somebody without any judicial process simply because he had published truthful information. Barry Pollock, Assange's US lawyer, told Yahoo News. Assange is now housed in a London prison as the courts there decide on a US request to extradite the WikiLeaks founder on charges of attempting to help former US Army analyst Chelsea Manning break into a classified computer network and conspiring to obtain and publish classified documents in violation of the Espionage Act. Now, what Julian Assange was doing is no different than what any journalists do. He was trying to help his source conceal her identity so that she could get these documents that she was already planning on taking out. She just didn't want to get caught taking out these documents because, yes, she got tortured. She got put in solitary confinement just for revealing US war crimes. They revealed torture programs in the US. They revealed soldiers laughing while killing innocent civilians in Iraq. I mean, and there's way more that was revealed in those Iraq war logs. And those Iraq war logs were published by mainstream outlets like New York Times, like Der Spiegel in Germany. These were journalistic activities that Julian Assange was participating in. My hope, or quote, my hope and expectation is that the UK courts will consider this information and it will further bolster its decision not to extradite to the US, Pollack added. There is no indication that the most extreme measures targeting Assange were ever approved, although I've shown little evidence they might have been, in part because of objections from White House lawyers, but the agency's WikiLeaks proposals so worried some administration officials that they quietly reached out to staffers and members of Congress on the House and Senate Intelligence Committees to alert them to what Pompeo was suggesting. Quote, there were serious intel oversight concerns that were being raised through this escapade, said a Trump national security official. Some National Security Council officials worried that the CIA's proposal to kidnap Assange would not only be illegal, but also jeopardize the prosecution of the WikiLeaks founder. Concerned the CIA's plans would derail a potential criminal case, the Justice Department expedited the drafting of charges against Assange to ensure that they were in place if he were ever brought to the US. In late 2017, in the midst of the debate over kidnapping and other extreme measures, the agency's plans were upended when US officials picked up what they viewed as alarming reports that Russian intelligence operatives were preparing to sneak Assange out of the United Kingdom and spirit him away to Moscow. The intelligence reporting about a possible breakout was viewed as credible at the highest levels of the US government. At the time, Ecuadorian officials had begun efforts to grant Assange diplomatic status as part of a scheme to give him cover to leave the embassy and fly to Moscow to serve in the country's Russia mission. Now, I haven't seen any evidence that he was going to Russia. What I've seen is evidence that Ecuador was giving him a diplomatic passport so that he could go to Ecuador. But that was foiled by the CIA spying on him. And I think I have that later here. In response, the CIA and the White House began preparing for a number of scenarios to foil Assange's Russian departure plans, according to 3 former officials. Those included potential gun battles with Kremlin operatives on the streets of London, crashing a car into a Russian diplomatic vehicle, transporting Assange and then grabbing him, and shooting out the tires of a Russian plane carrying Assange before it could take off for Moscow. US officials asked their British counterparts to do the shooting if gunfire was required, and the British agreed, according to a former senior administration official. I mean, this is human rights disaster. This is like them going so far to attack a journalist, them going so far to hide their crimes against humanity, that they were willing to do anything, even if it included shooting people, poisoning people, kidnapping people. That is what they do when they don't want us to know their secrets. Quote, we had all sorts of reasons to believe he was contemplating getting the hell out of there, said the former senior administration official. It was going to be like a Prison Break movie. The intrigue over a potential Assange escape set off a wild scramble among rival spy services in London. American, British, and Russian agencies, among others, stationed undercover operatives around the Ecuadorian embassy. In the Russians' case, it was to facilitate a breakout. For the US and allied services, it was to block such an escape. Quote, it was beyond comical, said the former senior official. Got to the point where every human being in a 3-block radius was working for one of the intelligence services, whether they were street sweepers or police officers or security guards. And so I think this is interesting too. I'm just going to pull this up here. So we already watched that video. So now we have this video of police, British police, standing outside of the Ecuadorian embassy. And let's look at what they were looking at, because it tells us just how far back this plan goes. It was not just the Trump administration. It actually goes back beyond to the Obama administration. We'll see on this document here. So we got this police officer handing a binder over. What does the binder say? Extradition of Julian Assange, Operation Kudo. When's the date? 2015. They've been planning to extradite Assange since 2015. Obama didn't press the charges. He decided not to go ahead with it. But the entire reason why Assange never left that embassy is because they suspected that they had sealed extradition charges waiting for him, so that as soon as he walked out, if he went to Sweden to stand trial there, as soon as he left, he was worried he was going to be kidnapped. And this shows it was very, 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 very likely. So let's go on. I don't want to read all of it because this is a really long article. So let's just see for the next most important parts. Later that year, WikiLeaks also published several caches of classified and sensitive U.S. government documents related to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as more than 250,000 U.S. diplomatic cables. The U.S. keeps a lot of things secret, huh? Assange was hailed in some circles as a hero and in others as a villain. For U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies, the question was how to deal with the group, which operated differently than typical news outlets. Quote, "The problem posed by WikiLeaks was there wasn't anything like it," said a former intelligence official. How to define WikiLeaks has long confounded everyone from government officials to press advocates. Some view it as an independent journalistic institution. I do as well. I think it's pretty clear that they are. While others have asserted it is a handmaiden to foreign spy services. No, it's to show the public what our governments are doing, the secrets they keep from us. They lie to us blatantly. And let's give an example. Even Mike Pompeo, the guy that we've been talking about in this video, what does he say about CIA and lying?
I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses. It reminds you of the glory of the American experiment.
I mean, they admit it. The CIA's job is to lie. The CIA's job is to trick us, trick the public into doing what they want us to, into going into a regime change war operation they want. They don't want us to know the truth, because if we know the truth, we're going to be against that war. The CIA shouldn't exist. It shouldn't exist at all. JFK was assassinated shortly after he spoke about how he wished the CIA didn't exist. He wanted to crush it up and blow it into the wind. Now here we are, decades later, and it's still lying. It's still trying to kidnap and kill journalists. It is still doing war crimes for U.S. empire. So let's go on. But the Obama administration, fearful of the consequences for press freedom and chastened by the blowback for its own aggressive leak hunts, the U.S. under Obama had prosecuted more whistleblowers than any other U.S. president. Restricted investigations into Assange and WikiLeaks. Quote, "We were stagnated for years," said Evanina. There was a reticence in the Obama administration at a high level to allow agencies to engage in certain kinds of intelligence collection against WikiLeaks, including signals and cyber operations. That began to change in 2013 when Edward Snowden, an NSA contractor, fled to Hong Kong with a massive trove of classified materials, some of which revealed that the US government was illegally spying on Americans. WikiLeaks helped arrange Snowden's escape to Russia from Hong Kong. Now let's remember, Snowden was also planning on going to Central or South America. He was only supposed to be stopping over in Russia, but they blocked his passports. So once he's landed in Russia, he could not leave. A WikiLeaks editor also accompanied Snowden to Russia, staying with him during his 39-day enforced stay at a Moscow airport and living with him for 3 months after Russia granted Snowden asylum. Snowden's still there today. He does talks all the time. He does webcam broadcasts. He talks about politics and news all the time. He's a very, very, very smart guy. In the wake of the Snowden revelations, the Obama administration allowed the intelligence community to prioritize collection on WikiLeaks, according to Evanina, now the CEO of the Evanina Group. Previously, if the FBI needed a search warrant to go into the group's databases in the US or wanted to use subpoena power or a national security letter to gain access to WikiLeaks-related financial records, that wasn't going to happen, another former senior counterintelligence official said. That changed after 2013 because they were so angry about Edward Snowden. People were calling him a traitor to his country. They were saying that what he did was terrible, all for showing us that our government had lied. James Clapper said under oath in front of Congress, no, we are not doing the mass collection of Americans' metadata. Not wittingly. We know now it was wittingly. From that point onward, U.S. intelligence worked closely with friendly spy agencies to build a picture of WikiLeaks' network of contacts and, quote, and tie it back to hostile state intelligence services, which, as we showed from Pompeo, they were not able to do. The CIA assembled a group of analysts known officially as the WikiLeaks team and its Office of Transnational Issues with a mission to examine the organization, according to a former agency official. Still chaffing at the limits in place, top intelligence officials lobbied the White House to redefine WikiLeaks and some high-profile journalists as, quote, information brokers, which would have opened up the use of more investigative tools against them, potentially paving the way for their prosecution, according to former officials. It, quote, was a step in the direction of showing a court, if we got that far, that we were dealing with agents of a foreign power, end quote, a former senior counterintelligence official said. Among the journalists some U.S. officials wanted to designate as information brokers were Glenn Greenwald, then a columnist for The Guardian, where he actually helped break the Edward Snowden story. He was one of the main journalists involved in breaking that story that the U.S. government was lying to us about mass collecting our cell phone data. And Laura Poitras, a documentary filmmaker who had both been instrumental in publishing documents provided by Snowden. Quote, is WikiLeaks a journalistic outlet? Are Lori Poitras and Glenn Greenwald truly journalists? The former official said. We tried to change the definition of them, and I preached this to the White House and got rejected. I mean, they don't want to define people as journalists because journalists have protection. We've seen what they do to Julian Assange by not considering him a journalist. So I wanted to actually show this tweet from Glenn Greenwald, published today, I believe. CIA and Mike Pompeo were stopped by White House lawyers from carrying out their plot to kidnap or assassinate Assange, but the U.S. government continues to slowly kill him instead. In 2019, 2 years ago, doctors warned that what they were doing to him was killing him. He was in that embassy in Ecuador for like 8 years. He's been in Belmarsh prison for like 2 or 3 years. So he's been suffering in torturous conditions. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture says that he's being tortured, all for doing investigative journalism that revealed war crimes so big and so newsworthy that even the mainstream media had to cover it. In January, a UK judge rejected the US request to extradite Assange solely on the grounds that his health could not withstand it. Despite this, the Biden DOJ ignored all press freedom groups, appealed that decision, and demanded he stay in prison pending appeal. I mean, that's why this is not just a Trump and Republican thing. Yes, they are the ones who tried to kidnap and assassinate Assange. Yes, they're the ones who officially brought the charges forward. But as I've demonstrated, they've been spying on Assange. They've been trying to persecute Assange, trying to classify him as not a journalist so that they can persecute him for revealing war crimes. That's been going on under Democrats and Republicans. The U.S. government is slowly suffocating, silencing, and killing someone solely for the crime of reporting documents that every major media outlet in the world determined was newsworthy. And a few in the U.S. corporate media care because he's never been in their clique. And so now we have the only factions which support the ongoing imprisonment of Assange are CIA and their allies in the US and UK corporate media. Support for him is global and spans the ideological spectrum. And Glenn shows this, and I'm going to show you the videos here too. Support for him is global and spans the ideological spectrum. Listen to what ex-Brazilian President Lula da Silva said in 2020.
Bom dia, eu queria te dizer a você, a todos os líderes do mundo, ao Trump, ao primeiro-ministro inglês, ao primeiro-ministro francês e ao mundo inteiro o seguinte: o Assange deveria, nesse momento, estar sendo definido como um herói da democracia, como um herói da liberdade, como um herói da comunicação, como um cara que prestou bem à humanidade, sabe, denunciando os crimes de guerra cometidos pelos Estados Unidos da América do Norte. Eu até disse ontem que ele deveria estar sendo votado para ganhar o Prêmio Nobel da Paz. Porque se os democratas do planeta Terra envolvendo todos os jornalistas, todos os advogados, todo sindicalista, todo político, não tiverem coragem de se manifestar em defesa do Assange, para que ele não seja extraditado, significa que tem muitos democratas mentirosos. Significa que a liberdade de imprensa, tão cantada em versos prosa pelos donos dos grandes jornais, é mentira. Porque o Assange não merece ser punido. O Assange merece ser reconhecido como um homem que prestou enorme serviço à humanidade, denunciando o genocídio das guerras, denunciando a mentira, a manipulação, às vezes, dos Estados Unidos, o maior poder do mundo. O Assange não pode ser extraditado se as pessoas acreditarem em democracia. Sabe? Porque os jornais que deram a notícia não foram processados. Não foi preso nenhum dono de jornal. Como é que pode um jornalista ser preso e condenado por prestar informação que todos os jornais defendem?
So that was former Brazilian President Lula da Silva. I'm not going to talk about it much here, just going to mention it briefly. Maybe we'll do a whole video on it. He was actually arrested in a corruption scandal that turns out it was all a fraud, and the U.S. had been involved in it. It helped Jair Bolsonaro, the far-right president now in Brazil. It helped him gain power. So, and Lula, you know, he's allied with communists in his country. He was allied in the past with Hugo Chavez and the government in Cuba, you know, the socialist government in those countries. He's defended them. He governed as a social democrat, but he's on the far left of the spectrum generally. And so now we're going to show the other end of the spectrum here. We've got, in full agreement with Lula, not just in outcome but rationale, is the most watched conservative in US media, Tucker Carlson, who repeatedly advocated for Assange's pardon and gave airtime to his family and supporters to do so. Only security state servants support this prosecution against Assange. Now let's see this video.
Julian Assange has been in jail for an awfully long time. He's now in jail in the UK. He was under house arrest in a foreign embassy in London. The US has now accused Julian Assange of violating the Espionage Act. This has been going on for a long time, and it shows how dumb we are that it took us a very long time, years, to ask the obvious question. What exactly did Julian Assange do wrong? Everyone, all good people hate Julian Assange. What was his crime exactly? Was he hacking into other people's computers? Was he stealing secrets from the U.S. government? No, actually, he was publishing things that other people sent to him. He was a journalist. He was an editor. That's literally true. Should you throw editors in jail because they embarrass you? Probably shouldn't. Not a good precedent to set, even if you don't like the person's politics. You should be against that. A wide group of people are against it, it turns out. We spoke recently to Pamela Anderson, who's trying to get a pardon for Assange. Watch this.
He needs to do the right thing. This is one of those moments in history, in his lifetime too, that he needs to make the right decision. And so it's all up to, President Trump. But he would really gain a huge following and a huge sigh of relief and gratefulness for so many people on the planet.
We spoke to Roger Waters of Pink Floyd about it. Tonight we're going to speak to Julian Assange's father and brother. John Shipton is his father. Gabriel Shipton is his brother. We're happy to have him on the show tonight. John, Gabriel, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank
John,
you, Thank you.
First to you, this is a sincere question. What did your son do wrong exactly? What is his specific crime?
Well, no specific crime at all, Tucker. He's just offended some people in certain sections of Washington and consequently has faced 12 years now of persecution and harassment. And Julian, as you know, is not.
Yeah. I mean, that's just, we can see clearly that whether you are on the left, whether you are on the right, people agree that what's happening to Julian Assange is persecution of a journalist for doing investigative journalism work. Even the Obama administration, who ramped up some of these spying operations against him, even they weren't willing to bring the charges forward because of the precedent that it would set, that if they can get Julian Assange for publishing classified materials, what's to stop them from going for CNN? What's to stop them from going for New York Times? I mean, these outlets, these corporate media outlets that just throw him under the bus and smear him, they're digging their own grave. They should be covering this case much, much more adamantly. And it's a shame that it takes somebody conservative like Tucker Carlson to be speaking out about this, while, you know, the left-wing media, as they're accused of being by some right-wingers, they're not left-wing media. They are the corporate media. They are the capitalist media, and they don't care about Julian Assange because he embarrassed and exposed them for their corruption and war crimes. So let's continue with this article here. The Obama administration's policy was, quote, if there's published works out there, doesn't matter the venue, then we have to treat them as First Amendment protected individuals, the former senior counterintelligence official said. Quote, there were some exceptions to that rule, but they were very, very, very few and far between. WikiLeaks, the administration decided, did not fit the exception. So let's go down. I don't want to read all of this because this is, again, a very long article. By 2015, WikiLeaks was the subject of an intense debate over whether the organization should be targeted by law enforcement or spy agencies. Some argued that the FBI should take sole responsibility for investigating WikiLeaks, with no role for the CIA or the NSA. The DOJ, in particular, was very protective of its authorities over whether to charge Assange and whether to treat WikiLeaks like a media outlet. Then, in the summer of 2016, at the height of the presidential election season, came a seismic episode in the U.S. government's evolving approach to WikiLeaks, when the website began publishing Democratic Party emails. The U.S. intelligence community later concluded the Russian intelligence agency known as the GRU had hacked the emails. No evidence has been shown of this yet. In response to the leak, the NSA began surveilling the Twitter accounts of the suspected Russian intelligence operatives who were disseminating the leaked Democratic Party emails, according to a former CIA official. This collection revealed direct messages between the operatives, who went by the moniker Gucifers 2.0, and WikiLeaks' Twitter account. Assange at the time steadfastly denied that the Russian government was the source for the emails, which were also published by mainstream news organizations. So this is where I kind of get involved. This was crazy. So in 2016, I was heavily involved, as I've said before, in sharing a lot of these WikiLeaks emails on Twitter. I was one of the people going viral every day talking about it. I had messaged that Guccifer 2.0 account trying to get evidence of, they said, oh, we have Clinton Foundation emails. And I was like, can I see them? And they didn't provide them to me. And I asked them to share one of my tweets one time. And then, so shockingly, I had a BBC journalist DM me trying to accuse me of being a Russian agent or a Russian spy. And, I was 19 years old. I thought I was just doing investigative journalism. It scared the fuck out of me. And now I can see in hindsight, I mean, they were going for us. They were really going for us back then. Even so, Assange's communication with the suspected operatives settled the matter for some U.S. officials. The events of 2016, quote, really crystallized U.S. intelligence officials' beliefs that the WikiLeaks founder was acting in collusion with people who were using him to hurt the interests of the United States. No, we were revealing war crimes. After the publication of the Democratic Party emails, there was, quote, zero debate on the issue of whether the CIA would increase its spying on WikiLeaks, said a former intelligence official. But there was still, quote, sensitivity on how we would collect on them. And so I'm going to end this article here just because it's a really long article. We've been talking about it for a while. I want to talk a little bit more about the spying operations that ended up happening against Julian Assange during the Trump administration. So by Max Blumenthal of the Gray Zone does great work. Mainstream U.S. reporters silent about being spied on by a parent CIA contractor that targeted Assange. Despite being spied on and having their privacy invaded by the UC Global firm that targeted Assange, reporters from major U.S. news outlets have said nothing in protest. This was in 2020, so over a year ago now, or almost exactly a year ago now. Spanish security firm apparently contracted by U.S. intelligence to carry out a campaign of black operations against Julian Assange and his associates spied on several U.S. reporters, including Ellen Nakashima, the top national security reporter of the Washington Post, and Lowell Bergman, a New York Times and PBS veteran. So see, this spying operation went beyond WikiLeaks associates. To date, Nakashima and her employers at the Washington Post have said nothing about the flagrant assault on their constitutional rights by UC Global, security company in charge of Ecuadorian embassy in London, which seemingly operated under the watch of the CIA's then director, Mike Pompeo. PBS, the New York Times, and other mainstream U.S. outlets have also remained silent about the U.S. government intrusion into reporters' personal devices and private records. Gray Zone has learned that several correspondents from a major U.S. newspaper rebuffed appeals by WikiLeaks to report on the illegal spying campaign by UC Global, privately justifying the contractor's actions on national security grounds. So let's skip down a little bit to get to a report. Proof of UC Global's illegal spying campaign and the firm's relationship with the CIA emerged following the September 2019 arrest of the company's CEO, David Morales. Spanish police had enacted a secret operation called Operation Tabanco under a criminal case managed by the same national court that orchestrated the arrest of former Chilean military dictator Augusto Pinochet years before. Morales was charged in October 2019 by the Spanish court with violating the privacy of Assange and abusing his attorney-client privileges, as well as money laundering and bribery. A mercenary former Spanish Special Forces officer, Morales also stood accused of illegal weapons possession after 2 guns with the serial numbers filed off were found during a search of his property. So this guy spied on Julian Assange for the CIA, and we'll see later in this document, it's proven, it's ironclad. We know he did it. And he had illegal guns in his possession. The assassination angle is very much real here. The documents and testimony revealed in court have exposed shocking details of UC Global's campaign against Assange, his lawyers, friends, and reporters. Evidence of crimes ranging from spying to robberies to kidnapping, and even a proposed plot to eliminate Assange by poisoning has emerged from the ongoing trial. And so this was in 2020, a year ago, that the Gray Zone was reporting on this. And we didn't hear anything from mainstream news. This news story from Yahoo yesterday, which basically just elaborates on this and confirms this with security officials, this was known. We knew this a year ago. In an investigation for the Gray Zone, it's a very good article here, very in-depth. This May, this reporter detailed how the Las Vegas Sands Corporation of Trump mega donor Sheldon Adelson functioned as an apparent liaison between UC Global and Pompeo's CIA, presumably contracting the former on behalf of the latter. It was the second time Adelson's company had been identified as a CIA asset. The first was in 2010, when a private intelligence report sponsored by gambling competitors alleged that his casino in Macau was sending footage of Chinese officials gambling so they could be blackmailed into serving as CIA informants. Again, this is what the CIA does. They should not exist. And so I'm not going to go much more in depth about this. I want to get on to the Daniel Hale story. But, I mean, this just shows that the prosecution of Julian Assange by the U.S. government continued today. The case had been dropped by the judge in the UK. They said that sending Assange to the U.S. in our horrible prison conditions would be a death sentence for him. And yet, the Biden administration appealed the decision and is continuing the case. Biden in 2012 had called Julian Assange a high-tech terrorist. And you see Secretary of State Antony Blinken always talk about the free press. Look him up on Twitter. Look up Antony Blinken and free press. You'll see him always talk about the U.S. government protecting the press. Yet he is continuing this very same persecution against a journalist simply for revealing evidence of U.S. war crimes. And why? The U.S. government doesn't want to be held accountable. The Biden administration is complicit. The Trump administration is complicit. The Obama administration is complicit. I mean, that just needs to end. I've written letters to my congressmen, Jamie Rashkin, and my senators, Chris Van Hollen and Ben Cardin, all in Maryland. None of them have talked back to me yet. I've called them, still haven't heard anything yet. I've written to the Bernie Sanders press team, haven't heard anything back yet. No U.S. officials are talking about the case against Assange, even though a year ago, during the Trump administration, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Senator Jeff Merkley in Oregon. They spoke out about what was happening against Assange. But now that there's a Democrat in office, nope. All right, so now I'm going to talk about our last topic for the day. It connects again to U.S. imperialism, war crimes, government secrecy, everything we've been talking about so far. This kind of brings it home. So now I'm going to share my screen so we can see this again. So stand with Daniel Hale. Who is Daniel Hale? In May 2019, drone whistleblower Daniel Everett Hale was arrested and indicted on allegations that he disclosed classified documents about the U.S. military's assassination program, believed to have been the source material for a series in The Intercept called The Drone Papers. On March 31st, 2021, Hale pleaded guilty to a single count under the Espionage Act. See, usually the Espionage Act is used against people like Daniel Hale. It's used against whistleblowers who are revealing U.S. war crimes. Against Assange, that's the first time it's ever been used against a publisher. Carrying a maximum sentence of 10 years. On July 27, 2021, Daniel was sentenced to 45 months in prison, all for revealing U.S. war crimes. Hale is a veteran of the U.S. Air Force. During his military service from 2009 to 2013, he participated in the U.S. drone program, working with both the National Security Agency, the NSA, and the Joint Special Operations Task Force at the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan, the Jets ended. After leaving the Air Force, Hale became an outspoken opponent of the U.S. targeted killings program, U.S. foreign policy more generally, and a supporter of whistleblowers. He publicly spoke out at conferences, forums, and public panels. He was featured prominently in the award-winning documentary National Bird, a film about whistleblowers in the U.S. drone program who suffered from moral injury and PTSD. And we'll see here, Daniel Hale is one of these people. Hale was based his criticisms on his own participation in the drone program, which included helping to select targets based on faulty criteria and attacks on unarmed, innocent civilians. So let's see here. Whistleblower jailed for showing 90% of people killed by U.S. drones are bystanders. This was Daniel Hale who revealed this, and is going to prison for 45 months for this. Daniel Hale, a former member of the U.S. Air Force, leaked classified information about drone warfare to a reporter after leaving the military. He revealed that 90% of those killed by U.S. drones in Afghanistan are innocent bystanders, not the intended target. According to NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden, he should have been given a medal. Instead, he's being given prison time. Quote from Edward Snowden, Daniel Hale, one of the great American whistleblowers, was just moments ago sentenced to 4 years in prison. His crime telling this truth. 90% of those killed by U.S. drones are bystanders, not the intended target. He should be given a medal. So let's see here. I want to find some details. With the Trump administration that started the attack on Hale, the Biden administration has continued the assault. Again, bipartisan, both parties. The U.S. has zero tolerance for whistleblowers and those who leak classified information that, according to the prosecutors, greatly threatens national security will pay the price. According to Scahill, who he leaked to, the initial threat of decades in prison against Hale was a cudgel deployed by prosecutors in an effort to break Hale's spirit and to frighten other prospective whistleblowers. That President Joe Biden's Justice Department continued this prosecution instead of dropping the Trump administration's case serves as an ominous reminder that the war on whistleblowers is a permanent fixture of the U.S. system. The use of the Espionage Act by successive administrations to prosecute whistleblowers is an affront to basic liberties and the constitutional rights of the accused, as it prevents people of conscience from presenting a real defense before a judge or jury. Its use to target dissent, independent journalism, and whistleblowing is an authoritarian weapon, masquerading as a law, and it should be abolished. And so, talking about this hypocrisy of U.S. sanctions from earlier in this episode today, we put sanctions on countries we deem authoritarian. We put sanctions on countries who we accuse of committing war crimes. And yet our sanctions are human rights abuses in and of themselves. The U.S. attacks whistleblowers. The U.S. attacks journalists. The U.S. is engaged in authoritarian behavior ourselves, and we should have no right to sanction countries, trying to force them through violence to our will. It makes no sense. And so, in a little bit more contemporary relevancy to this drone program we're talking about here, so we know the war in Afghanistan recently ended, and people were praising the Biden administration for getting out. You know, Kyle Kalinske had said, yeah, it could have been done better, but everybody complaining about that. It was going to be bad anyway. We should give him credit. This was a good thing. Well, Biden did say he's going to continue the war on terror in Afghanistan. Now, what does the war on terror in Afghanistan do? It does things like this. U.S. general admits drone strike near Afghan airport that killed 10 was a mistake. At least 7 children were killed in the strike. U.S. Central Command General Frank McKenzie admitted at a briefing Friday that the August 29th drone strike near Kabul airport was a mistake. 10 people were killed in the strike, which the U.S. believed was targeting a terrorist, but instead killed an aid worker and others in the area. Quote, I am now convinced that as many as 10 civilians, including up to 7 children, were tragically killed in the strike. Moreover, we now assess that it is unlikely that the vehicle and those who died are associated with ISIS Khorasan or were a direct threat to U.S. forces. I offer my profound condolences to the family and friends of those who were killed. And so basically, this was here where the U.S. government, again, the U.S. government did a war on terror drone strike, claiming that they were killing terrorists. And they killed 10 innocent civilians, no terrorists. And that's why, in my opinion, the U.S. war on terror is a Trojan horse for endless war. The U.S. war on terror, for every civilian you kill, you radicalize their entire family and community. You create more terrorists when you do this war on terror. You don't end terrorism through a bomb. And so we even have North Korea, everybody's favorite authoritarian government. North Korea here had a great take on the U.S. war on terror. Let's read it. Undeserved victims of indiscriminate counterterrorism. The U.S. forces adorned the denouement of, quote, the most protracted war in the U.S. history, the war that deprived numerous people of their lives for the past 20 years since its invasion of Afghanistan with the civilian massacre. We can show a little civilian massacre. On August 29th, the U.S. forces stationed in Afghanistan, just before their complete withdrawal from this country, launched a drone strike on the vehicles en route to Kabul International Airport and announced that the strike annihilated 2 terrorists. However, the experts in the media that made an on-site inspection announced that the victims of the last drone strike were not terrorists, but 10 guiltless civilians, which include an Afghan technician working in a soybean processing factory operated by an American civil society organization, as well as his young children. On September 14th, the spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, when asked by a journalist on this matter, clarified that the U.S. should not seek to give an evasive reply to the extensive query and ununanimous denunciation from the international society, but make a thorough investigation into the truth of the incident at all costs to present the Afghan people and international society with a responsible answer. The past incidents of killing innocent people in Afghanistan by indiscriminate bombing of the U.S. under the pretext of annihilation of terrorists are simply too many to enumerate, with the last incident nothing more than the tip of the iceberg. WikiLeaks has revealed extensive U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan. But the DPRK foreign ministry continues here. In the year 2002, the U.S. Air Force bombarded a wedding hall in the local province of Afghanistan, resulting in the heavy toll of hundreds of people. In 2008, the U.S. Air Force mounted an air raid on a village in Herat, Afghanistan, killing more than 100 people, including 50 children and 19 women. According to the recent foreign media report, the U.S. mounted in total more than 90,000 air raids on Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and many other countries for the past 2 decades, and the number of civilians killed in the course amounts up to 48,000 civilians killed. Despite these facts, the U.S. has never once made an honest reflection on its behavior. This time, too, the U.S. has sought had sought to cover up the truth of the incident until it reluctantly admitted its fault, when faced with the stern eyes of the international society and clear evidence. The U.S. is well advised to explicitly reveal its barbarities committed in Afghanistan and all around the world under the cloak of, quote, counterterrorism. The U.S. is doomed to face the trial of history if it tries to avoid it. And as we see from what the U.S. government does to whistleblowers, what they do to journalists like Julian Assange who publish their war crimes, they're not owning up to what they've done. They are continuing to hide it. We have extensive classified information in the U.S. that hides war crimes. One of the key things that the U.S. forces in Afghanistan did before they leave was smash up documents, smash up computers. They don't want their war crimes, their torture programs to be revealed to the world. And so I wanted to end today by reading Daniel Hale's letter to the court ahead of his sentencing of 45 months in prison for revealing drone strike program killing civilians. It's a really powerful letter by Daniel Hale. It really stuck with me. And I just wanted to read it and kind of do some commentary on it so we can hear it. I mean, Daniel Hale is a hero. He is not a criminal. He is not somebody who deserved to go to prison for exposing these crimes. July 18, 2021. Quote, "We now kill people without ever seeing them. Now you push a button thousands of miles away. Since it's all done by a remote control, there's no remorse. And then we come home in triumph." This was said by a U.S. Navy Admiral Jean LaRogue speaking to a reporter in 1995. Things have not changed. Dear Judge O'Grady, it is not a secret that I struggle to live with depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Both stem from my childhood experience growing up in a rural mountain community and were compounded by exposure to combat during military service. Depression is a constant. Through stress, particularly stress caused by war, can manifest itself at different times and in different ways. The telltale signs of a person afflicted by PTSD and depression can often be outwardly observed and are practically universally recognizable. Hard lines about the face and jaw, eyes overbright and wide, now deep set and fearful, and an inexplicitly sudden loss of interest in things that used to spark joy. These are the noticeable changes in my demeanor marked by those who knew me before and after military service. To say that the period of my life spent serving in the U.S. Air Force had an impression on me would be an understatement. It is more accurate to say that it has irreversibly transformed my identity as an American. Having forever altered the thread of my life story, weaved into the fabric of our nation's history, to better appreciate the significance of how this came to pass, I would like to explain my experience, deployed to Afghanistan as it was in 2012, and how it is I came to violate the Espionage Acts as a result. In my capacity as a signals intelligence analyst stationed at Bagram Airport, I was made to track down the geographic location of handset cell phone devices believed to be in the possession of so-called enemy combatants. To accomplish this mission required access to a complex chain of globe-spanning satellites capable of maintaining an unbroken connection with remotely piloted aircraft, commonly referred to as drones. Once a steady connection is made and a targeted cell phone device is acquired, an imagery analyst in the US, in coordination with a drone pilot and camera operator, would take over using information I provided to surveil everything that occurred within the drone's field of vision. This was done most often to document the day-to-day lives of suspected militants. Sometimes, under the right conditions, an attempt at capture would be made. Other times, the decision to strike and kill them where they stood would be weighed. The first time that I witnessed a drone strike came within days of my arrival to Afghanistan. Early that morning, before dawn, a group of men had gathered together in the mountain ranges of Patika province around a campfire carrying weapons and brewing tea. That they carried weapons with them would not have been considered out of the ordinary in the place I grew up, much less within the virtually lawless tribal territories outside the control of the Afghan authorities. Except that among them was a suspected member of the Taliban, given away by the targeted cell phone device in his pocket. As for the remaining individuals to be armed of military age and sitting in the presence of an alleged enemy combatant that was enough evidence to place them under suspicion as well. Despite having peacefully assembled, posing no threat, the fate of the now tea-drinking men had all but been fulfilled. I could only look on as I sat by and watched through a computer monitor when a sudden terrifying flurry of hellfire missiles came crashing down, splattering purple-colored crystal guts on the side of the Morning Mountain. Since that time and to this day, I continue to recall several such scenes of graphic violence carried out from the cold comfort of the computer chair. Not a day goes by that I don't question the justification for my actions. By the rules of engagement, it may have been permissible for me to have helped to kill those men whose language I did not speak, customs I did not understand, and crimes I could not identify in the gruesome manner that I did, watch them die. But how could it be considered honorable of me to continuously have laid in wait for the next opportunity to kill unsuspecting persons who, more often than not, are posing no danger to me or any other person at the time? Never mind to honorable. How could it be that any thinking person continued to believe that it was necessary for the protection of the United States of America to be in Afghanistan killing people, not one of whom present was responsible for the September 11th attacks on our nation, notwithstanding in 2012, a full year after the demise of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan, I was a part of killing misguided young men who were but mere children on the day of 9/11. Nevertheless, in spite of my better instincts, I continued to follow orders and obey my command for fear of repercussions. Sound familiar? Follow orders. I just followed orders. It's not my fault. Sounds kind of like Nazi Germany. Yet, all the while becoming increasingly aware that the war had very little to do with preventing terror from coming into the United States and a lot more to do with protecting the profits of many weapons manufacturers and so-called defense contractors. The evidence of this fact was laid bare all around me. In the longest, most technologically advanced war in American history, contract mercenaries outnumbered uniform-wearing soldiers 2-1 and earned as much as 10 times their salary. Meanwhile, it did not matter whether it was, as I had seen, an Afghan farmer blown in half, yet miraculously conscious and pointlessly trying to scoop his insides off the ground, or whether it was an American flag-draped coffin lowered into Arlington National Cemetery to the sound of a 21-gun salute. Bang, bang, bang. Both served to justify the easy flow of capital at the cost of blood, theirs and ours. When I think about this, I am grief-stricken and ashamed of myself for the things that I've done to support it. The most harrowing day of my life came months into my deployment to Afghanistan when a routine surveillance mission turned into disaster. For weeks, we had been tracking the movements of a ring of car bomb manufacturers living outside of Jalalabad. Car bombs directed at us at U.S. bases had become an increasingly frequent and deadly problem that summer. So much effort was put into stopping them. It was a windy and cloudy afternoon when one of the suspects had been discovered headed fastbound, driving at a high rate of speed, or eastbound. This alarmed my superiors, who believed he might be attempting to escape across the border into Pakistan. A drone strike was our only chance, and already it began lining up to take the shot. But the less advanced Predator drone found it difficult to see through clouds and compete against strong headwinds. The single payload MQ-1 failed to connect with its target, instead missing by a few meters. The vehicle, damaged but still drivable, continued on ahead after narrowly avoiding destruction. Eventually, once the concern of another incoming missile subsided, the driver stopped, got out of the car, and checked himself as though he could not believe he was still alive. Out of the passenger side came a woman wearing an unmistakable burqa. It's astounding as it was to have just learned that there had been a woman, possibly his wife, there with the man we intended to kill moments ago. I did not have the chance to see what happened next before the drone diverted its camera when she began frantically to pull something out from the back of the car. A couple of days passed before I finally learned from a briefing by my commanding officer what took place. There indeed had been the suspect's wife with him in the car, and in the back were their 2 young daughters, ages 5 and 3 years old. A cadre of Afghan soldiers were sent to investigate where the SA-2 or where the car had stopped the following day. It was there they found, then placed in the dumpster nearby. The eldest was found dead due to unspecified wounds caused by shrapnel that pierced her body. Her younger sister was alive, but severely dehydrated. As my commanding officer relayed this information to us, she seemed to express disgust, not for the fact that we had errantly fired on a man and his family, having killed his daughter, but for the suspected bomb maker having ordered his wife to dump the bodies of their daughter in the trash, so that the two of them would more quickly escape across the border. Now, whenever I encounter an individual who thinks that drone warfare is justified and reliably keeps America safe, I remember that time and ask myself, how could I possibly continue to believe that I am a good person, deserving of my life and the right to pursue happiness? 1 year later, at a farewell gathering for those of us who would soon be leaving military service, I sat alone, transfixed by the television, while others reminisced together. On television was breaking news of the president giving his first public remarks about the policy surrounding the use of drone technology in warfare. His remarks were made to reassure the public of reports scrutinizing the deaths of civilians in drone strikes and the targeting of American citizens. The president said that a high standard of near certainty needed to be met in order to ensure that no civilians were present. But from what I knew of the instances where civilians plausibly could have been present, those killed were nearly always designated enemies killed in action unless proven otherwise. Nonetheless, I continued to heed his word as the president went on to explain how a drone could be used to eliminate someone who posed an imminent threat to the United States. Using the analogy of taking out a sniper with his sights set on an unassuming crowd of people, the president likened the use of drones to prevent a would-be terrorist from carrying out his evil plot. But as I understood it to be, the unassuming crowd had been those who lived in fear and terror of drones in their skies, and the sniper in this scenario had been me. I came to believe that the policy of drone assassination was being used to mislead the public, that it keeps us safe. And when I finally left the military, still processing what I had been a part of, I began to speak out, believing my participation in the drone program to have been deeply wrong. I dedicated myself to anti-war activism and was asked to partake in a peace conference in Washington, D.C., late November 2013. So again, this was under a Democrat, Barack Obama. People had come together from around the world to share experiences about what it is like living in the age of drones. Fazil bin Ali Jabbar had journeyed from Yemen to tell us what happened to his brother Salem bin Ali Jabbar and their cousin Walid. Walid had been a policeman, and Salem was a well-respected firebrand imam, known for giving sermons to young men about the path towards destruction should they choose to take up violent jihad. One day in August 2012, local members of Al-Qaeda traveling through Fazil's village in a car spotted Salim in the shade, pulled up towards him and beckoned him to come over and speak to them. Not one to miss an opportunity to evangelize to the youth, Salim proceeded cautiously with Walid by his side. Fazil and other villagers began looking on from afar. Farther still was an ever-present Reaper drone looking too. As Fazil recounted what happened next, I felt myself transported back in time to where I had been on that day, 2012. Unbeknownst to Fazil and those of his village at the time was that they had not been the only ones watching. Salim approached the jihadist in the car. From Afghanistan, I and everyone on duty paused their work to witness the carnage that was about to unfold. At the press of a button from thousands of miles away, 2 Hellfire missiles screeched out of the sky, followed by 2 more. Showing no signs of remorse, I and those around me clapped and cheered triumphantly, as we saw from a WikiLeaks released video by Assange and Chelsea Manning. Not this specific instance, but similar. In front of a speechless auditorium, Fazil wept. About a week after the peace conference, I received a lucrative job offer if I were to come back to work as a government contractor. I felt uneasy about the idea. Up to that point, my only planned post-military separation had been to enroll in college to complete my degree. But the money I could make was far more than I had ever made before. In fact, it was more than any of my college-educated friends were making. So after giving it careful consideration, I delayed going to school for a semester and took the job. For a long time, I was uncomfortable with myself over the thought of taking advantage of my military background to land a cushy desk job. During that time, I was still processing what I had been through, and I was starting to wonder if I was contributing again to the problem of money in war by accepting to return as a defense contractor. Worse was my growing apprehension that everyone around me was also taking part in a collective delusion and denial that was used to justify our exorbitant salaries for comparatively easy labor. Again, people who work those types of jobs don't work as hard as a laborer. The thing I feared most at the time was the temptation not to question me. Then it came to be that one day after work, I stuck around to socialize with a pair of coworkers whose talented work I had come to greatly admire. They made me feel welcome, and I was happy to have earned their approval. But then, to my dismay, our brand new friendship took an unexpectedly dark turn. They elected that we should take a moment and view together some archived footage of past drone strikes. Such bonding ceremonies around a computer to watch so-called war porn had not been new to me. I partook in them all the time while deployed in Afghanistan. But on that day, years after the fact, my new friends gaped and sneered, just as my old ones had. The sight of faceless men in the final moments of their lives, I sat by watching too, said nothing, and felt my heart breaking into pieces. Your Honor, the truest truism that I've come to understand about the nature of war is that war is trauma. I believe that any person either called upon or coerced to participate in war against their fellow man is promised to be exposed to some form of trauma. In that way, no soldier blessed to have returned home from war does so uninjured. The crux of PTSD is that it is a moral conundrum that inflicts invisible wounds on the psyche of a person made to burden the weight of experience after surviving a traumatic event. How PTSD manifests depends on the circumstances of the event. So how is the drone operator to process this? The victorious rifleman, unquestioningly remorseful, at least keeps his honor intact by having faced off against his enemy on the battlefield. The determined fighter pilot has the luxury of not having to witness the gruesome aftermath. But what possibly could I have done to cope with the undeniable cruelties that I perpetuated? My conscience, once held at bay, came roaring back to life. At first, I tried to ignore it, wishing instead that someone better placed than I should come along to take this cup from me. But this too was folly. Left to decide whether to act, I could only do that which I ought to do before, God and my own conscience. The answer came to me, that to stop the cycle of violence, I ought to sacrifice my own life and not that of another person. So I contacted an investigative reporter with whom I had an established prior relationship and told him that I had something the American people needed to know. Respectfully, Daniel Hale. That's a heavy story. And so I think the moral of all of this here is that U.S. involvement in wars, whether it be militarily, boots on the ground, whether it be drone strikes, or whether it be U.S. sanctions that harm civilian populations, kill people all the time around the world. It's immoral. It's wrong. And the American people shouldn't stand for it anymore. It's bipartisan. It's both political parties who support drone strikes. It's both political parties who support harmful U.S. sanctions. We have to end the duopoly. We have to end the capitalist duopoly and move on to socialism, anti-war activism. We can't keep making excuses for this type of thing. Till next time. So thanks for watching my first episode of the ProPeace Report, kind of a heavy one. I'm currently a college student in Sweden, and I'm having a lot of problems getting my student loans. In order to get my student loans, so even though I'm getting my loans from FAFSA, they won't direct deposit it right into my US bank account. They are making me, so I had to get my residence permit. Once the physical residence permit showed up, then I had to get my personal number. A few weeks after that, I thought I was finally going to get my Swedish bank account, but nope, I need my Swedish ID first. I'm currently waiting for the next 3 weeks for my appointment to get that Swedish ID. Then after that, I will get my Swedish bank account. And then after I get my Swedish bank account, it'll be a few weeks after that, they finally deposit my loans. And so I need all of the support that I can get right now. I'm borrowing a lot of money from my parents until those loans show up. But so if you see below this scrolling bar right here, my Cash App is ProPeace97, $ ProPeace97. Please donate. I'm going to start putting out a lot of videos like this. Hopefully, multiple times a week is the goal. But I don't want all of this money to be from me. I do have the support I need to at least survive. My parents, this is not helpful for them either. They can't really afford to be giving me this much money either. But I would like to give 50% of all money I get from this podcast, not just now, but throughout. I want to give 50% of it to mutual aid groups. I want to give it to activist organizers. I want to give it to people around the world who need financial support. And so 50% of all the money you donate will go to mutual aid organizations. For now, the one that I have in mind is Rome's Tour for the Poor. He's been traveling the US, giving people food, giving people clothing. I think it's really, really good work. His work has inspired my work in a lot of ways. So that's the one I have top of mind. I have a few other organizations I'm considering. But so at the end of the month, I will count up all of the money that you all have given me. And on a future podcast, I'll announce, how much did I get? Okay, now where am I going to be giving the money to? So please, please, please help support me, help support mutual aid groups across the US. And, this is what's necessary for the working class to get power in this country. Thank you so much.